been some mention today, and there's a lot of debate about various pricing practices that people find offensive or sort of exploitative or whatever. These are practices like price walking or hidden add-ons or personalized pricing, as not necessarily just pricing, but there's also issues about the way things are marketed, self-preferencing, pressurized selling, all these sorts of issues. And there's a real public concern about this, and political concern, and it's all channeled into the idea that market economies are about greedy firms in amoral markets. And there's a lot of increasing opportunities for these sorts of novel pricing practices, the availability of data with digital markets, and also what I call an ugly phrase, servicization, as to we're converting from buying CDs to streaming music and things like that. So there's this concern about evolving pricing practices. And regulators have been really trying very, very hard to respond to this. And they've often struggled with using consumer law. And the enforcement is rather clumsy and slow. And it all looks like ex-post firefighting by regulators. They wait and wait, and after years of trying to gather the appropriate data and things, they then try and regulate either through consumer law or within regulated markets by a direct regulation. And we think they're getting really inadequate guidance from standard welfare economics, and come back to that. Widespread acceptance that consumers are not perfectly rational, so behavioural consumers, and begun to talk a bit in the earlier sessions about paternalism, especially in David Leibson's paper. We'll come back to that, but what we're proposing is a view of business to consumer relationships framed in terms of transactional fairness. And the idea is to ensure that business practices are ethical, but within the context of an innovative market economy that respects individual choice. So there are two ethical principles, really, that are underpinning our approach, and these are really from years of Bob's work that we're picking up on here. Firstly, the principle of mutual benefit. And here, the view is that transactions are a cooperative activity and should be conducted with the intention of mutual benefit. You're not doing it just for your own benefit, but a transaction is something which you would hope that the buyers were getting something out of just as much as the sellers are. So in order to do that, firms need to behave in such a way that consumers with normal expectations, I'll define those shortly, can understand the consequences of a transaction. So that's the principle of mutual benefit, and that's complemented by a principle of voluntary market transactions. And this is a view of the market as providing opportunities for transactions, and individuals should be able to voluntarily choose the ones they want. And I'll come back to that as well. Now, this is a view of markets that sort of the normative view is one of which is meant to make markets morally attractive and not just focus in on efficiency reasons. And I think that that economics has over-focused on efficiency reasons over recent decades, really. Traditionally, if you go back to Adam Smith and many other economists of his era, we think of the the invisible hand and inefficiency of competitive markets. But he also talked at the same time about the obvious and simple system of natural liberty of markets, but these are really attractive things for people to be able to make their choices in. And John Rawls, we all know about his sort of theory of justice, but that was embedded in the idea of competitive markets as cooperative ventures for mutual advantage. So this is taking us a different normative slant to the one that we usually put on. And part of that is because we think that's an important slant, but also the other normative approaches that we're more used to are pretty useless when it comes to consumer policy. So moving from those sort of foundational ideas, we can easily move towards the firm facilitating consumer understanding of what to expect if you buy from me, and the firm should also not hinder consumers from exploring other opportunities in the market. In terms of moving from the abstract ethical world, as it were, towards the practical world, then business practices are likely to be context dependent. Well, we know that they are. A car boot sale or a sale from someone on eBay has a different expectations if you're a consumer to if you go into a big name department store, if you can find one that's still open, or the app store, where you would have different expectations. So the idea of normal expectations is that is what most consumers would expect of seller behavior in a particular context or a particular market. We also, almost as an aside, want to think about a concept which is useful for consumer policy, but also not just to guide regulators, but to guide firms in their behavior and when they're thinking about what should thinking about a new pricing practice. Is this something which we should be doing or not? And requiring sensible information. So our definition of transactional fairness, and this is our core concept, is that it requires a firm to act in such a way that consumers with normal expectations about pricing practices first are able to understand the consequences of transacting with that firm. That's what we call the no deception condition. And secondly, are not hindered from terminating a relationship with the firm or from transacting with alternative sellers. That's our no hindrance principle. And furthermore, we suggest that a firm's got to be able to defend the rationale for its pricing practices, locating them as part of a business model based on mutual benefit between the firm and its customers. So it goes a little bit beyond caveat emptor, but I'll come back to what it's not very shortly. And they've got to be willing to present that rationale publicly. And that's what we call the public explanation condition. I just want to say a few things about those. Firstly, we've been talking about no deception, no hindrance. It can be either active or passive. So we think things like it's deceptive to introduce a novel pricing practice without explaining that it's a deviation from normal expectations. So it's just a question of keeping the consumers up in their common understanding of the expectations of that transaction. or to present information with misleading salience or omit relevant information. The public explanation condition may be slightly more puzzling than the no deception, no hindrance. There are a number of reasons for it. For instance, as a way of coordinating normal expectations about pricing practices, as a compliance self-test, so that you can, as I said just now, you can be sitting back and think, is this an appropriate thing, or will it contravene good consumer policy or consumer law, as we like to think of it? It can be a reputational discipline that you've got to stand up there and explain what you're doing. And of course, it could lead to sort of enforcement and regulatory appraisal. But what public explanation is not, is it's not public opinion, which has been some source of confusion when we've given this paper before. So the role of the media in general campaigns or even political statements would be to reveal a business practice to be defended, right? And say, you know, we think this is a very dodgy practice. It's harming consumers, but it doesn't determine. A media campaign doesn't determine what is fair. Transactional fairness has got these independent ethical foundations that we must judge by. While we're on what it's not, transactional fairness is not distributional fairness. It's not that we disagree with issues to do with distribution and the concept of distributional fairness, but it's not what we think consumer law should be about, and we don't think that that unfairness to one customer can be sort of weighed against unfairness to another in terms of transactional unfairness. It's about that relationship between a firm and a consumer. We've got other policies around, and we've got competition policy for what's the effects between firms. This is between a firm and a consumer. It doesn't require pro-social behavior. It's not talking about philanthropic firms. Mutual benefit doesn't mean you're not profit seeking. It's perfectly all right. Profit seeking, but it's not, you've got to embrace all sorts of things to do with the welfare of your customers. Just you want them to understand what you're offering them so that they can make their own decision on that. It doesn't require their shares of the surplus or a correction of biases or paternalism in any way. Okay, so it's focused on that relationship between a firm and a customer and their transaction, and that's what we see the role of consumer law. And in fact, transactional fairness is entirely consistent with much of existing consumer law, but we think it adds a little bit. So on this slide, on the left-hand side, I've got transactional fairness, and the right-hand side is, it's taken from the EU Unfair Business Consumer Commercial Practices Directive, but that's been incorporated in UK law and in the law of all other European countries. Of course, the UK could now go about changing this if it wanted, but that's another issue. But the UK EU stuff on the right-hand side is sort of a good example of the sort of consumer law out there. So we've got consumers with normal expectations are able to understand the consequences of transacting with a firm and are not hindered from transacting with another firm. And the current consumer law talks about business behavior that materially distorts the economic behavior of the average consumer. So it's a material distortion, which it clarifies by appreciably impairs the consumer's ability to make an informed decision, thereby causing the consumer to take a transactional decision that he would not have taken otherwise. There's a couple of ways you can interpret that, and the thereby clause, as we refer to it, can be interpreted as just a matter of materiality. So, you know, is this business practice materially distorting, and that's it entirely consistent with what we have to say. About measuring that distortion is another issue. So the consumer law at the moment is about the consumer outcome, not the process, whereas transactional fairness, as we'd like to see consumer law go, is about the transactional process rather than the outcome. It's about facilitating the consumer decision on the transaction. And we think that's founded in these intuitive criteria, ex ante standard of fairness, which I outlined earlier. And I think that's a clearer line of thought than the trying to sort of assess materiality ex post leads to a long list of blacklist of conduct, which is thought to regularly materially distort consumer decisions. Nothing in that blacklist that we would disagree with. There's a lot of this stuff comes to the same point, but I think much quicker and sharper if you think about it in terms of transactional fairness rather than assessing materiality. We talk about deceptive or hindering practices. The current law talks about misleading or aggressive. We see deceptive, active and passive as exactly the same as misleading actions and omissions. We're not making a point there, it's just the language we've chosen. But there's a difference, we think, between hindering practices and aggressive practices. In the law as it stands, aggressive practices are limited to harassment, coercion, and undue influence. That's pretty strong stuff. We think that no hindrance is broader than that. And it embraces things like exploding offers, late renewal notices, locked mobiles, various things like that, as ways which are hindering behavior. And we think that in competition law, when you talk about exclusionary behavior and perhaps exclusive contracts and the rest of it, that's always about the between firms. You know, is a dominant firm excluding a potential entrant, whereas, you know, this is looking at from the perspective of is the firm preventing the consumer from choosing a transaction, which is about the relationship between a firm and its consumer. So very briefly, the neoclassical behavioral welfare economics, why are they inadequate? Well, they're both based on the aggregation of the welfare of individuals. It's just that with behavioral welfare economics, sort of and the nudging agenda and rest, it's based on biases and errors because revealed preference doesn't reveal, choice doesn't reveal actual preference. Now, at the bottom of the slide, I've got a couple of cases there which I'll try and give a sense of. Mr. Smith has the same insurance firm for 5 years and pays £500 for building insurance. His neighbour is quoted £300. This is as a result of the price walking over the years. The FCA asked a survey of people about this, do they think it's unfair? And only 9% thought it was fair. So we think there's a mismatch between those normative principles of traditional welfare economics and the moral perspective by which we find pricing practices as unfair. So I think I'll just, because I can see Sally pressurizing me there. So we need our contribution, summarize it in 3 bullets. First, providing an intuitive normative economic foundation for consumer law, which can be used to understand the issues and guide behaviour. We clarify the differences between unfair transactions and socially efficient or distributionally unfair outcomes. And we also think that the no hindrance condition fills a gap between consumer and competition law. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And that is time. You have a few questions popping up in the Q&A and in the chat, so you might want to have a read for those and consider them. But I hope we'll also give our full attention to Christine Riefa. She will be the next presenter. She is a law scholar who has not written the book on consumer law, but she has written 3 books on consumer law, particularly in relation to protection of consumers and vulnerable consumers. So I will hand it over now to Christine, and then we will come back to questions later.
Great, thank you so much. Can I check that everyone can hear me okay and see my slides? Brilliant. Well, thank you very much to the CCP and this wonderful invitation to present some of them.
Sorry, Chris, can you just put your slides on presenter view?
Have I?
On the slideshow, just to slideshow.
There we go. We thought the technology was working, but the human is failing.
No, it's not failing, just one more step. Super, thank you.
Right, so thank you so much. I've obviously enjoyed an extremely rich and stimulating couple of hours, and I hope that I can add to this in the way you think and reflect on consumer protection. Today, I'm presenting a book that I co-wrote with Paolo Siciliani, who's an economist and competition expert, and Harriet Gamper, who's a consumer law specialist. So the credit is really not just mine, it's really theirs too. And in that team, I can really be best described as the lawyer and the consumer lawyer at that. So my field of expertise is perhaps much narrower than your audience and all your other wonderful speakers. In the book, we have reflected on the concept of fairness in consumer markets. And thanks to Paolo Siciliani's foresight, we have borrowed the concept of theories of harm that all competition lawyers and economists will be familiar with. And we tried to apply it to consumer law. And what we found is that in doing that, we could really yield some very positive results for consumers by enabling and freeing enforcers from a lot of the constraints they normally have. So in the book, we effectively advocate for a more economic approach to consumer policy making and consumer enforcement. The use of economics, however, in consumer law is enabling something that competition lawyers will have experienced more as a contraction of intervention. When in competition law, theories of harm were introduced and a more economic approach to competition law was introduced, effectively it did limit the powers and the ability of the enforcers to act on markets. In consumer law, we think it can have the opposite results. way we look at theories of harms in consumer law also is in the book. There's a nice bit of a chapter that looks at the fact it's not a revolution, it's nothing to be scared about. It's more a natural evolution, that theories of harm are already existing in a lot of the but-for tests that lawyers are using in consumer law, and therefore that it could be a really nice and neat instrument to move forward and actually correct some of the problems that the previous speakers has highlighted, and that consumer law is really struggling in some capacity to really defend consumers and protect them. So indeed, we can see, and I don't want to spend time on this, that there are many limitations in the way consumer law has been designed and has evolved over the years. It was primarily influenced by neoliberal economics, and that really has led to what the consumer lawyers always talk as, or name, the information paradigm, that we think the response we can give to protect consumers is to say, fine, inform the consumers, tell them, and behavioral economists are helping to refine this information. But ultimately, there is a fundamental problem in that model, according to us, and I think we're not the only one thinking that. There's also a huge problem, which is the reference points for consumer law. The person that is protected by the legislation is always this average consumer. And the average consumer that is used as this reference point is actually not average at all. It's the homo economicus, it's this super rational person that's able to take all of this information, compute it, make the right choices. And obviously we have heard, and there's a lot of literature on that, that is not the case. So that leads to problems and gaps and limitation into what the way consumer law is built at the moment can do to protect consumers. There's a link with competition law here as well, because there's also in the way consumer law is organized, a heavy reliance on competition law. And in the enforcement models that we tend to have, we also have a relationship between competition law and consumer law, which is a little bit bizarre to the consumer lawyer, obviously, where we tend to place more emphasis on competition. There is normally more enforcement mechanisms. So the UK is a good example. There's more tools, more legal tools for the enforcers in the competition side that there is on the consumer side. So for example, we don't have administrative powers in the UK for consumer law enforcement, but we do have them for competition law enforcement. So there's been this reliance on competition, being able to solve all the problems of consumers, that if we put a lot of emphasis there, we should be able to create very fair markets, and therefore our consumers are being protected as a byproduct of that. And that's obviously, again, we know has limitation and not completely true. So where our work comes in is we try to reflect on this status quo and thinking, how do we change this? What do we have to do? And Paolo Siciliani, again, was instrumental in devising the model that we have, and his great economic background and competition law expertise has really helped us in trying to look at consumer theories of harm that would be able to look at the market as a whole, and not just being demand side or supply side led in our reflection, but trying to look at all of the aspects and try and find a way we could tell enforcers, regardless of whether or not you have legislation to intervene, if you find yourself in one of those configurations, we can guarantee there will be harm to consumers and you need to do something with it. You need to act. So the theories of harm, which is obviously not my area of expertise, are organized along 4 main ones. We have names that are, and that's the caveat, they're not exactly accurate, but we thought we needed a shorthand. And we have looked at the scam, which is normally very well regulated. We have efficient legislation for that, but we also needed a starting point to understand what changed in the markets. We have a second theory of harm, which we've called the lemon, which will mostly apply for experiential and credence attributes. We also have the shock, which is about search characteristics mostly, and then the subsidy. All of those theories of harm, we find that when you start using them and reflecting on them, actually you can very easily, depending on your facts and what you can observe in your scenario, move from one to the other. I suppose the point I want to make today is not how the economics or how the theories work, but what we can take away from those and what led us to call for a general obligation to trade fairly in consumer law. And indeed, when you start observing the way the legislation operates, the way we've been applying the legislation, what you find is that in consumer law, interventions have been often based on whether or not the enforcers could actually find first a piece of legislation that enabled them to fix the behavior, or ask at least the business to fix the behavior. And what that means is that we have used instruments, notably the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive that you've just heard about. And we've also got a number of instruments in UK law. Perhaps we can be more creative with contract law, but by and large, there were tools that were there. But the tools that we're using are slightly imperfect in the sense that as far as the unfair commercial practice, which is the unfair trading regulations 2008 in the UK are concerned, what is control is not to trade unfairly. So you have got an expectation, not that the business will behave fairly, but that they will refrain from behaving unfairly. And that's a very different premise when you start thinking about it, that we are not currently demanding fairness by design, as we have called it, but we are actually simply demanding that businesses avoid being bad actors, market actors. So our main legal fix is really to call for a switch around of the liability model. It's about putting the onus on the trader to behave fairly rather than on the consumer to beware and on the consumer to then take action when it hasn't worked out for them. And consumer law indeed is built on the dichotomy between public enforcement and private enforcement, and there's a lot of reliance on private enforcement. This belief that the consumer, armed with the information, won't be had, and if it is, then it will act. It will go to court, it will claim remedies, and we know for sure this is not the case. And in England, there's been some interesting studies where we find that the people that are using the courts or the people that are using ADR to claim consumer rights are primarily white, middle-aged, well-educated men. And that's great for them. But the rest of the population and segments of the population that are also more vulnerable are not using their right to private enforcement. And that's hugely problematic, because if you look at it from a competition perspective, what we have been expecting in competition is also to have this participation of the consumer in order to regulate markets. The idea is the consumers can vote with their feet. But that's not true. We can't. Consumers, for us, and in the book, this is a position we defend, the average consumer, it's completely rational to be disengaged. It makes perfect sense. Why would I switch? And we've heard it from other speakers with much more refined explanation. It makes sense to not shop around. It makes sense to feed on this belief that we might have that markets are not going to work optimally and in our favor as consumers. I think the best example that works in that regard is privacy disclosure on the internet now. Thanks to the GDPR, we all have to click boxes after boxes, and we all end up saying, yeah, fine, just harvest the data you want, because why? Even if I spend the 3 minutes that it requires, I can't even check that you haven't taken my data. So consumers will disengage, and we think we can, and the book is arguing and is showing enforcers how we could use the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive and the UTRs in the UK and reinterpret notions we already have. So the average consumer, all we need to do is convince some judges that actually to be average is not to be well informed, is not to be very observant or circumspect, is simply to expect that that consumer might disengage, that that consumer might not understand the information. We can also do it by expanding the concept of professional diligence, and that's the one aspect that the previous speaker left out. There's actually a general clause in the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive and in the UTRs that actually enables to pick up all the practices that are not picked up by the other more specific obligations. And one of the important elements of that is professional diligence. And our view is that we can start conceptualizing professional diligence as a standard by which there is a duty to assist consumers in making choices, that there is a duty for businesses to behave rather than consumers to beware. And what we hope is that the book and the approach we are advocating can encourage consumer markets to start rewarding good businesses rather than encouraging and incentivizing actually bad business practices. Because from where we stood, at least, it seemed that all of the efforts that were done to control behaviors of firms were effectively not enabling real correction in markets. So from our point of view, the duty to trade fairly, which would be a positive obligation to do that, would be enabling to use consumer law at an early stage before there are any real widespread detriment experienced by consumers, which is part of the problem with competition law, even ex ante interventions or consumer law. It's often too late by the time we get to redress stage. We want to prevent. And that would also probably be a means to regulate markets that would be much cheaper than big competition law actions. Fairness is an objection that we have heard. Is complex. It's not a concept that common lawyers like or understand, and I don't believe that is true, at least not in the UK. And indeed, a positive obligation to trade fairly was first floated by the Office of Fair Trading in the 70s. So we have not invented anything here. And we also see in commercial law, notably looking at Leggett's decisions, that there is expectations on C2C relationships, that indeed businesses will collaborate more and will look to have some mutual benefits for one another. The duty to trade fairly would offer some flexibility. It's a concept that is more anchored in a principle-based approach to legislation, which I think is useful, although sometimes a little bit difficult from a common law perspective. But it means that you can adapt rules as markets change, as consumer expectations may change, and it will also offer a very strong ally in trying to help with consumer vulnerability. I think there's a lot of discourse at the moment on trying to help vulnerable consumers, and we're trying to create two-speed type of obligations, and notably in the energy market. And I think it would be very helpful to have a more flexible standard, this duty to trade fairly, in order to also help those consumers. And that's where I will leave my observations for today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christine. I think we'll have a bit of discussion in the question time about this idea of the average consumer, because we have some questions coming up on that. But before that, I'm going to hand over to Marshini Chetty, who is coming to us from the University of Chicago Department of Computer Science, where she directs the Amuli Internet Research Law Center. She's doing cutting edge research on how some of these behaviors actually are happening. So Marshini, can you hear us? And
yes, can you hear me?
Yes, and we can hear you. Wonderful.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And yes, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm definitely very different to the other speakers. So let me just, sorry, get my mouse working. Okay, so yeah, I'm from the University of Chicago, and I'm from the Department of Computer Science, and I run the AIR Lab for short. It's not law, it's actually just a lab, so not a lawyer. One of the things that we do in my lab is we're trying to make the internet more trustworthy. And so we have a focus on identifying misleading online content. So we're looking more at what consumers actually sort of see online. And then we're focused on creating tools to help consumers to learn about misleading practices and also protect themselves. So why trustworthy content? Sometimes it might just be a consumer sees something and doesn't know how to evaluate whether they should sign up for something. Other times they may see things like posts on social media and not know whether these things are ads. So for example, this is DJ Khaled. He's a hip hop producer, and he was fined a few years ago for advertising alcohol to use because he was not disclosing this as an advertisement. So there's really a need to inform internet policymakers like many of you here today, and also to help users to critically evaluate content so that they can protect themselves from online malfeasance. Although, of course, I don't want to advocate that we just place the burden on the consumer themselves. So my approach as a computer scientist is really, again, focused more on the consumer, understanding consumer needs, designing tools, evaluating these tools, implementing them, collecting data about what consumers are actually doing. And this is obviously also informed by theories, various theories from different fields like theories of privacy and so on. So I wanted to first tell you about, I'm going to speak about two case studies. The first is about dark patterns, which is, we've heard a lot about misleading content. And so dark patterns are just one of these kinds of misleading content online. So pretend I was actually trying to get to this conference in person. I had a look at flights. This was really just to London because the Norwich flights looked a little complicated. And you see a notice here, saying that there are only 3 tickets left at this price. And I probably wouldn't make it to the conference in time anyways. But what does that actually mean? Is this an accurate stock count, or is this a dark pattern? And what is a dark pattern anyways? So if it is just an accurate low stock count, maybe that's okay, that the business is just trying to tell a consumer what is available. But how do we know if this is actually deceptive and when it's affecting consumers negatively? So a dark pattern is just a way to say it's a trick that a website or app uses to make you do something that you didn't mean to, like buying or signing up for something. And this was a definition coined by Harry Brunel, a user experience designer in the UK. But more broadly, they're user interface design choices that benefit an online provider by coercing, steering, or sometimes deceiving users into making decisions that, if they were fully informed and capable of selecting alternatives, they might not make. So there are many different definitions of dark patterns, and I'll refer you to this paper by one of my co-authors and some other folks, or 2 of my co-authors. They basically looked at all the different definitions, largely based on anecdotal evidence, and sort of tried to distill out how we can actually evaluate whether a business has a practice that is negatively harming a consumer. So what they came up with are patterns or attributes of these dark patterns, and they sort of split it up into 2 themes that run across dark patterns. One is a dark pattern is something that has a manipulative information flow. So either it's deceptive, it induces false beliefs in the consumer, it might be hiding information. And secondly, a dark pattern can act by modifying the choice architecture that a consumer has. So this could be asymmetric, where one choice is easier to access than another. It could be covert, when the users don't even understand that they're being influenced. There could be differential treatment, where one group of users is disadvantaged over another. And then finally, it could be restrictive, where there's some options eliminated altogether. And I'm going to show you some examples where it's quite clear that something is a dark pattern, unlike the low stock count example that I showed you earlier. So this is based on a study that we did of 11,000 shopping websites globally. So we had noticed that most of the evidence about dark patterns was anecdotal, self-reported, and we wanted to gather data to see if these patterns were actually prevalent on the internet. So there were some challenges to gathering the data set. We had to mimic a real user browsing shopping websites, collect and store the data, and then analyze it. So this meant creating a shopping bot where we could actually sort of browse different websites, choose things like product colors, sizes, and then add them to a shopping cart. And then we collected screenshots of everything up until this point. We did not have thousands of dollars, so we did not actually buy the products, but this is kind of where our analysis sits. Now, I tell you this because I want you to know that the dark patterns I report on are lower bound numbers, because we didn't examine every aspect of the shopping website. And what we found was that out of the 11,000 shopping websites, that at least 11% of them had some sort of dark pattern on the website. So I'm just going to give you 3 examples of some of the more deceptive dark patterns. One of them was the dark pattern of urgency, or sort of pressurized selling, as it was mentioned earlier, where many shopping websites have timers that sort of indicate that a sale is about to end to try to get consumers to buy the product. And what we found was that when we revisited many of these pages to look to see what happens when the timer expires, we found that some of them were deceptive, that when the timer expired, it either just reset or the sale was actually still available once the timer was expired. Another case of, a true deception, well, not true deception, but another dark pattern, I should say, is called misdirection. And here, businesses are basically using what we call confirm chaining to make asymmetric choices for users. So for example, if you want to get a discount, you might see two choices like, yes, I'd like the discount, or no thanks, I like full price. Or similarly, if you don't sign up for something, you get a message saying, no thanks, I'd rather join the pay full price for things club. So again, in both of these cases, you can see that consumers are sort of being directed to one choice more than another. And then the last example I'll give is one of a dark pattern called social proof, where people are given activity notifications, again, to sort of encourage them to buy things on the site. So these might be things like 28 people have viewed this product in the last 24 hours, or something like Jacqueline from Jacksonville just saved $52 on her order. And again, in some of these cases, we looked at the scripts behind how these messages were generated and found that in at least a few examples, these were utterly deceptive. For example, on a site called threadup.com, the Jacqueline from Jacksonville was just pulled from 2 lists of names and places. So it could have easily just been, Marshini from Norwich just saved, 52 pounds on her order. We also found in this study that there are many enabling plugins that people can use to easily set up their shopping websites and include these kinds of dark patterns in their shopping websites. And we created a large data set that can give you some other examples of these sorts of dark patterns that exist in the wild. So if you want to see more about this, you can visit the website that we created. So I think the major takeaway for the dark pattern side of things that I want you to sort of understand is just that there is a need to identify what kinds of misleading online content is out there so that we can inform some of these regulations. This large-scale evidence actually can show whether something is prevalent or not, and also enable us to design tools that are more consumer-facing. In the Federal Trade Commission, for example, has looked at this. They just conducted a workshop on dark patterns and are trying to see how to regulate on this. California has banned some forms of dark patterns recently in 2021 with the California Consumer Privacy Act. There was a bill that some senators have tried to pass in the US called the Deceptive Experience to Online Users Act, also targeted only certain dark patterns, but I don't think that it passed at all. So dark patterns obviously affect all aspects of consumer lives, including privacy. And the benefit here is, unlike, sort of like Bruce was alluded to, it's not always mutual between the business and the consumer. And this is not always a voluntary transaction because people are not always informed. So the second case study that I'd like to mention today from some of the other research we've done is on another kind of dark pattern, which is disguised advertisements. So here is a YouTube video from a top influencer. Her name is Elle of the Mills. This video that I pulled, last year, I think, she had 1.6 million subscribers. This video alone had 1.9 million views. If you actually look in the description of the YouTube video, you'd see that she has this link to a service called betterhelp.com for counseling. And what she doesn't tell you is that if people are clicking through this or actually signing up for the service, that she's getting paid for those signups. And this is a form of what we call affiliate marketing. But importantly, she doesn't disclose that she's doing that. And the Federal Trade Commission here in the US actually says that if there is a connection between an endorser like Elle and a marketer like betterhelp.com, then it has to be disclosed. Otherwise, it is deceptive advertising. So what we did was we scraped 500,000 YouTube videos and 2.1 million pins from a site called Pinterest. And we actually started examining them and looking at the URLs that people were including in their descriptions. What we found was that each of these links that people were including had to have some sort of identifier so that the marketer knows who to pay. So for example, betterhelp.com needs to know they need to pay Elle. So in the URL itself, it has an identifier for Elle. And we noticed this pattern for all the URLs, that there is always an identifier for the influencer so that payment can actually be directed to the influencer. The nice thing about that is that you can then use that fact to detect when someone is doing affiliate marketing, because once you know what the patterns are, you can actually see where those patterns exist in different YouTube videos, for example, or any other kinds of social media posts. And we discovered about 57 patterns that corresponded to 33 affiliate marketing companies, the biggest of which is Amazon.com. So we also then were wondering, okay, now that we can identify who's actually doing affiliate marketing using this sort of link as a ground truth, how often are people actually disclosing? So we looked at the descriptions below the videos. So again, here's what a description looks like. And we found that out of the affiliate marketing videos and pins, only 10% of the influencers and 7% of the people on Pinterest were actually disclosing that they were doing affiliate marketing. There were 3 ways that they were disclosing it. I'll mention 2. One was a very basic way that they just say something like affiliate links are present. Maybe you didn't even know what an affiliate link was before this talk, right? So it's not very explanatory. And then some people were actually using a more sort of explanation kind of disclosure where they say that they're receiving money or a commission for sales. How common were the different types of disclosures? Unsurprisingly, not only are people not disclosing very much, the most common kinds of disclosures tend to be the ones that just say affiliate links are present. So we actually use this information to experiment and run an experiment to see if people understand. So do consumers actually understand when someone is disclosing that they're doing this kind of marketing, whether or not the person is being paid? And what we found is that most often consumers understand when someone is using an explanation type disclosure, but they understand affiliate links disclosures much less. And then finally, we actually created a tool which can detect in YouTube videos when someone is doing affiliate marketing. And this consumer-facing tool just sort of puts up a minimally intrusive banner that says whether a sponsorship has been detected. It highlights the affiliate links or any promotion codes that the influencer is using. And a promotion code might be something like, for Elle of the Mills, for example, it might be use my promo code Elle of the Mills. And basically, this ad intuition sort of detects that. So we actually trialed ad intuition in the wild with about 300 consumers or so. And we found that it was very useful for people to understand when someone is actually doing affiliate marketing, even if they hadn't included a disclosure. And then interestingly, we also learned a lot about how people watch YouTube videos. For example, many people are just watching the same influencers over and over again. So it means that there's a disproportionate number of consumers that may or may not know when someone is doing affiliate marketing. So what does this all mean, and how does this relate to consumer protections regulations? Oh, and by the way, Ad Intuition is available for Firefox and Chrome, so it's an extension that you can install. So I guess the major takeaway here is, these kinds of user-facing tools can help raise awareness and education for consumers. We kind of need these kinds of tools to help us also collect data about how these sort of misleading online contents manifest in the wild and how they're actually affecting consumers, and can inform policy. And obviously, consumers are voluntarily consuming social media content, but they may not always understand this kind of dark pattern where influencers are being paid. Just as an anecdote, PewDiePie, which is one of the top influencers from Sweden, he has, I think I pulled this yesterday, 110 million subscribers, 2 million views. This work that we did got some press, and actually he started using the basic affiliate link disclosures. So I just want to raise this point to say that not only is this research kind of useful, but it also, when these cases become very prominent in the media, it can actually also have this effect of getting people to comply with different regulations. So what are some open questions? How do dark patterns affect different types of consumers? What about privacy in dark patterns? And obviously, how do we decide if something's dark and actually legislate on it? And then, with voluntary sort of transactions and so on, what kinds of tools can actually help consumers detect or become more aware of dark patterns in the first place? And I'll just end with another example. The Federal Trade Commission recently fined, or at least went after ABC Mouse, which is a company that is run by Age of Learning. And basically, this was because it was really hard to cancel the service. And so more than 200,000 people are being refunded because they were experiencing this dark pattern of, just being unable to cancel this service. So thank you. I'd also like to thank my co-authors on this work and our funders, the National Science Foundation.
Thank you very much, Marshini. I think what I would like to do is go through some of the questions first that are on the Q&A, and then let some of our conference speakers who have put questions in the comments box perhaps speak for themselves. And the first question that I would like to kind of address together. So we have a question about this average consumer.
Nathan's not coming on? I wondered if Nathan was coming on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Let me just try to put my camera.
And Nathan and I spoke at length on Monday about his intervention, and I just about skipped to.
So I am trying to put my video on without success. I hope I'll be able to do that at some point. I'll keep trying.
I know you have some slides, Nathan, if you want to go ahead.
Yes.
Nathan is the principal economist for Ofcom, which is a communications regulator here in the UK. And so before we get on to this issue of the average consumer and what we can expect from them, we're going to hear from Nathan a bit of a response to the papers and an intervention about fairness from their perspective.
Thank you, Sally. I think I'll try to do three things. I'll try to pick out some points that stood out for me in the three really interesting talks we've heard. And then I'll say a little bit about the work Ofcom has done on fairness. Promoting fairness is a priority for Ofcom. And finally, I'd like to make some general remarks about the risks of intervening as well. So let me start by commenting on the sort of three presentations. I thought it was very interesting that the point that Bruce Lyons made, that traditional welfare economics is probably inadequate, and we need, and sort of focuses too much on efficiency, and that we need see if I can do this, and that we need some other framework, and it's great to see a strong theoretical framework for fairness. I thought another really interesting talk from Christina Riefa about consumer theories of harm and the possibility of duty to trade fairly. And one of the things there that stood out for me was that Christine said that fairness makes economic sense. I generally agree with that, but I might come back to that a little bit, because I think occasionally there can be tension between fairness and economic efficiency, and I think it'd be good to talk about that explicitly. I found Marshini Chetty's talk slightly frightening, how easy it is for online companies to be unfair, but also reassuring to know that there are people working on tools to try to help educate consumers. Another sort of general theme for me was that I think this the importance of fairness is growing and will continue to grow as we sort of buy more things online and buy more things through subscriptions, where I think there's much more scope for there to be unfairness. So it's great that lots of people are working in this area. So let me tell you a little bit about what Ofcom has done recently on fairness. So last year we published our fairness framework, which describes how we'll assess fairness concerns and the types of questions and factors we'll consider in seeing whether customers are treated fairly. It can be thought of as a sort of guide for how we'll prioritize our work, and hopefully it gives companies a good idea of what's likely to give us concerns. There are two fairness concepts in it: procedural fairness and distributive fairness. Procedural fairness is to do with how a firm treats its customers, and is somewhat similar to transactional fairness, but it's not exactly the same. In particular, it's not as fully specified as transactional fairness, and it isn't built up in the same way from underlying theory. Distributive fairness is to do with differences in outcomes between customers, whether some customers pay more than others. And we make clear that we'd be particularly concerned if vulnerable customers were disadvantaged. Other interventions include, we obtain commitments from all the UK's major fixed and mobile providers to a general set of fairness commitments that are designed to embed a fairness of culture within the industry. We've taken various measures over the years to make switching easier. For example, we recently banned mobile handset locking, and that might be consistent with the no hindrance condition mentioned earlier. We've also last year imposed an obligation on companies to tell customers when they're reaching the end of their contracts, and also to tell them what's the best tariff that's available to that customer, and also to tell them what's the best tariff available to all customers, even if it's not available for that customer, for example, if it's only available to new customers. And that might have some similarities with the no deception condition mentioned earlier. So that's just a sort of flavour of the many interventions that Ofcom's taken on fairness. So the final thing I want to talk about is the risks of intervention. Sorry, see if I can move slides. Oh yeah. And I should make clear here that these are my own views rather than necessarily being the views of Ofcom. We heard a little bit about the risk of intervention in the first session this morning, for example, on nudges where things weren't as successful as initially hoped. I think there's for me, there's sort of two big risks with interventions. Firstly, they may be ineffective. So if you place obligations on companies, they may find a way around those. If you have informational remedies, consumers may not sort of pay attention to the information or may not respond as expected. So there's a risk that interventions just end up adding costs to industry with no benefits for consumers. But even worse than being ineffective, interventions can sometimes make things worse in some way. there can be unintended consequences that are actually bad for consumers. And this isn't just theoretical. Most well-known example in the UK is probably Ofcom's intervention in the retail energy market in 2009 to limit price discrimination. This is intended to address what was seen as unfair prices, where price differentials didn't reflect cost differentials. But research by the Centre for Competition Policy found that this probably weakened competition and led to higher prices for consumers. And I think that intervention was withdrawn after a few years. Another example of interventions that didn't go to plan is an intervention by Ofcom into 2015. It's to do with the prices for calling 0870 and 0845 numbers, amongst other things. And we found mixed results. Some of the effects were unexpected and detrimental to consumers, and we learned some lessons for future policy making from that. And in part, I think some of this risk of making things worse relates to the possibility of tension between fairness and economic efficiency. So I should say first that I generally I think fairness and economic efficiency go together. I'm probably speaking here about procedural fairness, leaving distributional fairness on one side. Generally, they go together. So if you're providing better information for consumers, if you're reducing barriers to switching, that'll generally improve procedural fairness and also lead to markets working better and greater economic efficiency. So generally, they go together. But it is possible, at least in theory, for there to be tension between fairness and economic efficiency. And I'm not sure whether this is controversial with others. I'd be very interested to hear. For me, this is mostly to do with price discrimination. And I know procedural fairness doesn't rule out price discrimination. And similarly, transactional fairness doesn't rule it out. But I think it does make price discrimination more difficult and will tend to reduce it. And that's probably good most of the time. But it is possible for price discrimination to be beneficial for economic efficiency. And this is particularly the case where there are large economies of scale, which is usually the case in regulated sectors, and it's certainly the case in communications. Maybe it's less the case in financial services, but I'm not sure. And when you've got large economies of scale, price discrimination can sometimes help to lower prices. And price discrimination can also lead to some investments being made that might be hard to do if there were less price discrimination. So I think it's possible for moves to push procedural fairness to weaken economic efficiency, but I stress that won't generally be the case, but it can occasionally happen. And I don't see a problem with this. I certainly don't think that one should always trump the other, but rather you just have to consider them in the round and sort of weigh them up when whatever you're looking at. And the final thing I wanted to say was that because there's this risk of interventions not going to plan, whether they're ineffective or sort of have detrimental effects, it's really important to monitor and evaluate evaluations. And Ofcom is committed to doing more evaluations. And sort of the earlier papers this morning talking about nudges sort of also suggest the benefit of looking not only at the short-term effects, but also at the long-term effects of interventions. And it was raised this morning, the FCA's interventions in the general insurance market. I think everyone will be looking very closely at the future evaluation of that. And the FCA does a great job at evaluating its interventions. So we will look forward to seeing that in due course. And we hope that but by monitoring and evaluating our interventions, we can learn any lessons and evolve and improve our policy making to deliver the best outcomes for consumers. So Thank you.